All right, we're on our last section of notes here for the Old South for today. We've seen how Dred Scott, we've seen how they're doing things there, and we're left with this aspect. And I like this picture a lot just to start. You see the disenfranchisement of this poor farmer. You can tell his head is down. He really doesn't like what he's doing, and things aren't going well. Now, they go, and there's a saying in Spanish that says they went from Guatemala to Guadapeor. Means they went from bad to worse, and things got worse. How can they be worse than this? How about if you were telling people what to do? So, a system comes about in many of the southern states, and they're called the Black Codes. And so what were the Black Codes? The Black Codes basically were a way that black people were expected to behave in the South. And so that's a really questionable thing, and there's so many of them in there, and we'll look at it in class. And so if you weren't in class, I'm sorry, you can look at it in your packet. But we're going to talk about a big thing here. Now, one of the big black codes was that they didn't want them being in similar places. They didn't want them on the same train. They didn't want them in the same theater at this time, because movies aren't popular. They didn't want them anywhere cohabitating, because they actually believed that they would infect the other races. And so that was part of the Black Codes. Now, one man decided to challenge the Black Codes. His name is Homer Plessy. And if you're looking at this man, you're going, how on earth is he black? He's actually 1/8 black. That means he has a grandparent somewhere down the line who was black. Now, how did they have this? Because of the Redeemers in the Solid South. They had census records, which told you who your grandparents were and were not. And so they determined it based off that, okay? So Homer Plessy gets on a railroad car, and he is told, no, sir, you cannot sit here. You've got to go to the back. And he's, what's the deal? We're just going on a train, right? And so, because he was separated and sent somewhere else, he decided to go to court and sue that people. And so, what he ultimately decides to do is he will sue the owner of that railroad car named Mr. Ferguson. And the 1896 major court case, and we're going to spend time on this, is called Plessy vs. Ferguson. And so you would think he would win, correct? Wrong. He loses because of the 14th Amendment. Mr. Ferguson said, I have provided equal protection for both races. They just have to go here and here. Now, because of this, and because they actually upheld the Black Codes, we have a very important term come out of Plessy vs. Ferguson, and it is called the separate but equal doctrine. Basically, as long as you are in some way proving or saying that you are protecting the races under the 14th Amendment, you're allowed to separate them. And so this will provide for years and years of hate and animosity going into the 1960s when it's finally outlawed. And it starts right here with this court case. Now, the next thing they did is they took that separate but equal ruling and they ran with it. And they came up with a bunch of laws throughout the South, much like this one, that are called Jim Crow laws. And I'll explain why Jim Crow here in a second, okay? So Jim Crow laws, what you really need to get here and understand is these are laws meant to keep the races apart, the separate but equal, to keep the whites away from the blacks and vice versa. And so right here we have waiting room for colored only, and it's by order of the, notice here, police. If you disobeyed this, you got arrested or some type of fine, okay? And so here's the thing about Plessy vs. Ferguson, side of the arrestor of here. Notice his middle name was Adolf, right? It's interesting. Not Adolf Hitler, not even spelled right, but that was a popular name before Adolf Hitler, okay? Now, a great story came out of this. If you know about Dr. Seuss, and you'll learn about it later on, Dr. Seuss was actually a political cartoonist. And he came up with a story of the Sneetches, as they're called. And so right here we have the star belly Sneetches have bellies with stars, and the plain belly Sneetches have none upon theirs. This was a story of blacks and whites. And it was basically as simple as these have stars and these don't. Just like this one was white and this one's black, or vice versa. I don't know who was who. So that's an interesting thing nonetheless. Now, going a little bit further into Jim Crow, why was it called Jim Crow? This man is an actor, and he put on a show, and he dressed up in this way, and he blackfaced himself, as they called it, meaning putting shoe polish, and he danced and he sung and he did this, and his actor was called, can you guess it? Jim Crow. And people loved this. They'd go to the theater and they would laugh, and by they I mean white people would go and laugh. I'm sure black people went and laughed as well if they could get in. So they adopted the name of Jim Crow, given the fact of this character, okay? And so Jim Crow laws, again, are laws that are designed to keep the races apart. Colored waiting rooms, etc. Now, different water fountains, different schools. I mean, there's so many, and there's some of them in your thing, and this is an expansion on black codes. Okay? Now, as we're approaching the new millennium, the big commodity was farming out in the Great Plains, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. And so these things came up that said all colored people want to go to Kansas. Hey, it's horrible where you are. You can do so for, look at this, $5. $5. Okay, in our day that gets you a foot long, but at this time, you could actually go and get land away from the South, away from the KKK. And so many people did, and so these people who took them up on this were called exodusters. Now, why exodusters? If you are Christian and you've heard the story of Moses, they actually call that the Exodus, where the Jewish people left Egypt, and so because they were being oppressed. And so, in essence, here the black people were being oppressed in the South. They left, exodusters. Okay, so exodusters are black farmers who left the South to go out west. All right. Now, two people we have to talk about, and then we'll stop here. The first man we need to talk about is Hiram Revels. All right. This is Hiram Revels. Now, who is Hiram Revels, and why is he important? Hiram Revels is the first black congressman, and he's from the state of Mississippi. And so this goes to show you that there were people in the South who were trying to go against this. Actually, to get elected, he had to kind of go around with unpopular policies amongst his people. But the idea is, once he got into Congress, he could make things happen. Now, the second person we need to talk about is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is considered the mother of the civil rights movement, and she's actually from Holly Springs, Mississippi, which if you go up Highway 7, you can see her museum, and it's pretty cool. At this time, she was living in Memphis, and she wrote a book that was entitled The Lynch Law in All Its Phases. Basically, she's trying to tell how horrible lynching is. And you can see here in the tree here, there's a noose hanging back here. Now, the main thing is she's actually persecuted so much, she has to leave the state and go to Chicago to continue to write, where she marries and becomes known as Ida Wells Barnett. And so there we have that, and that is the Old South. Now, we'll pick up with the South again later on when we have some other things. The next one we'll be going into is the West and populism, and this is a pretty cool one, okay?